On the afternoon of October 19, 2019, a Forest Service employee named Elias Brock walked the length of the empty parking lot at the Cedar Hollow trailhead and counted 6 vehicles. 5 of them belonged to 2 hikers who had already returned from the day-use trails and were preparing to drive home. The 6th, a dark green Subaru Outback with Washington plates, had been parked in the same space for at least 19 hours. Its driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, on the passenger seat, sat a folded paper map of the Cedar Hollow wilderness, a half-empty thermos of coffee gone cold, and a charging cable plugged into the dashboard with no phone attached. The driver was a 34-year-old software engineer named Daniel Reeve. He had vanished sometime in the previous 24 hours. He was an experienced backcountry traveler with hundreds of solo miles behind him. He had told his sister exactly which trail he intended to hike. He had filed a permit at the ranger station 2 days earlier. He had texted a friend at 6:14 the previous morning to say the weather looked clear and he was about to begin. Then nothing. No further messages, no location pings, no sightings. 6 years later, the case is one of the most studied unsolved disappearances in the Pacific Northwest, not because of how dramatic it was, but because of how ordinary it should have been. Cedar Hollow is the local name for a section of designated wilderness in the Western Cascades. Roughly 46 square miles of old-growth Douglas fir, granite ridgelines, and steep glacial drainages. It is not remote by Alaskan or Montanan standards. The nearest paved road is 5 miles from the trailhead. There is a ranger station 17 miles away. Cell coverage is spotty but functional from several of the higher ridges. The trails are well marked and heavily used in summer. By late October, however, the wilderness empties out. Daytime temperatures fall into the low 40s Fahrenheit. Nights drop near freezing. Snow can arrive without warning above 5,000 feet. Most of the trail register entries from that final week of the season belong to hunters, a small number of overnight backpackers, and a few day hikers chasing the last of the larch tern. Daniel Reeve had been planning the trip for nearly a month. According to his sister Marisa, he had been working long hours on a contract project and had grown noticeably tired in the weeks leading up to the hike. He had spoken about needing what he called a reset. His plan was simple. He would drive from his apartment in Bellingham on the evening of October 17th, sleep in the back of his Subaru at a primitive forest road pullout, and begin hiking at first light on the 18th. The route was a 22-mile loop that climbed from the trailhead to a high alpine basin, traversed 2 named ridges, and returned by a parallel drainage. He had completed similar loops several times. He carried a 40-liter pack, a lightweight tent, freeze-dried food for 3 days, a water filter, a stove, a compass, 2 paper maps, a small first aid kit, an emergency bivvy, and a satellite messenger that he had owned for 2 years. The morning of October 18th was, by all accounts, exceptionally clear. A weather observer at a nearby summit station recorded a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 6 in the morning, and visibility approaching 40 miles. There was no wind below the ridgelines. A light overnight frost had settled on the lower meadows. Daniel sent the message to his friend at 6:14. Phone records later confirmed the message had transmitted from a tower located approximately 3 miles southeast of the trailhead. After that, his phone went silent. The satellite messenger, which he had used to send tracking pings on every previous trip, never sent another signal after 7:09 that morning, recorded near a wooden footbridge less than a mile in. When Marisa did not hear from her brother by Sunday evening, October 20th, she was concerned but not yet alarmed. He had been late returning from trips before. By Monday morning, when his phone went directly to voicemail and he had not arrived at a scheduled work meeting, she called the ranger station. Within an hour, a deputy from the county sheriff was driving up the forest road toward the Cedar Hollow trailhead. He arrived shortly before noon to find the green Subaru exactly where Elias Brock had noted it the previous afternoon, untouched in the cold sunlight, the thermos still on the seat, the door still unlocked. The first 24 hours of any wilderness search are widely regarded as the most important. Statistically, lost or injured hikers are most likely to be found alive within that window, and the further from it the search extends, the steeper the survivability curve falls. By the time the official search for Daniel Reeve began on the afternoon of October 21st, more than 72 hours had passed since his last confirmed transmission. The initial search team consisted of 9 personnel. 2 were sheriff's deputies, 4 were forest rangers, 3 were volunteers from a county-level search and rescue group. They worked from the trailhead outward in expanding sectors, beginning with the most likely route. The trail register at the Cedar Hollow kiosk contained an entry in Daniel's handwriting, dated the 18th, marking his planned route and an estimated return of the 20th. Below his entry was the only other registration from that day, signed by a single individual who had marked a different trail and a same-day return. 5 hours into the search, a ranger named Patricia Allen reached the wooden footbridge from which the satellite messenger had last pinged. She found nothing on the bridge itself. The dirt on the trail beyond it was hard and rocky, and any boot prints had been disturbed by subsequent foot traffic earlier in the week. About 400 yards past the bridge, however, she located a single fresh-cut sapling beside the trail, its branch trimmed cleanly with what appeared to be a folding knife. Whether the sapling had been cut by Daniel was unclear. He was known to occasionally make trekking poles or repairs from deadfall, but had been carrying his own poles. The sapling was photographed and the location flagged for follow-up. By the morning of October 22nd, the search had expanded to 42 personnel, 2 K-9 teams, and a contracted helicopter operating out of a regional airfield. The weather, which had remained clear during the missing days, began to deteriorate. Cloud cover moved in by mid-morning. Light snow began falling above 4,000 feet. Within 48 hours, 6 inches of fresh snow lay across the upper basin, and any trace of recent human movement above treeline was effectively buried. Searchers concentrated on the planned loop. They covered roughly 90% of the route on foot and the remaining 10% by air. They examined every known camping site, every junction, every drainage. They found nothing. No discarded wrappers, no boot prints, no abandoned gear. The alpine lake at the route's halfway point was photographed and surveyed. The shoreline showed no signs of a recent visitor. By the time the snow forced a temporary halt to ground operations on October 25th, the search had logged more than 900 volunteer hours and produced not a single confirmed trace of Daniel Reeve beyond the morning of the 18th. Then, on October 27th, a witness came forward. A hiker named Carl Mendel, age 51, had been on the Cedar Hollow trails the same day Daniel had. He had not signed the kiosk register, a common omission among local hikers, but he had returned to his car by sundown and left without speaking to anyone. He learned of the disappearance from a regional news broadcast 9 days later and contacted the sheriff's office. According to his statement, Mendel had reached a junction roughly 6 miles up the main trail at approximately 10 in the morning. He had paused there to drink water and adjust his pack. While doing so, another hiker had come up the trail behind him, exchanged a brief greeting, and continued past him. Mendel described the man as in his early 30s, dark-haired, clean-shaven, wearing a navy blue rain shell and a tan baseball cap. The description matched Daniel exactly. The cap, in particular, had been a custom item embroidered with the logo of an outdoor gear company Daniel had worked for during graduate school. He owned 3 of them. Mendel said the encounter had lasted no more than 10 seconds. The hiker had walked past, taken perhaps another 30 paces up the trail, then stopped. Mendel watched him stand still for several seconds, looking back down the trail in the direction he had come from. He did not appear injured. He did not call out or wave. He simply stood there, as if listening for something. Then he turned, faced the trail ahead of him, and resumed walking. Within a minute he had disappeared around a bend in the forest. Mendel was certain of the time. He had checked his watch when the man passed. It was 10:04 in the morning. From that point on, no other witness in the wilderness reported seeing Daniel Reeve alive. The phone ping was not discovered for nearly 2 weeks. When investigators submitted a formal request to Daniel's wireless carrier, they expected to receive a record of his last known cellular contact, which would presumably correspond to the same general area as his final satellite messenger ping near the wooden footbridge. What they received instead was a record of a single tower handshake, registered at 1:53 on the afternoon of October 18th, from a tower located on the eastern flank of a ridge 11 miles from the planned loop, in a drainage that lay outside the boundaries of the original search area. The handshake was brief. The phone had not connected to the network long enough to send or receive any data. It had simply pinged the tower for approximately 4 seconds, and then dropped off. The signal could in principle have come from a phone elevated on a high ridge with line of sight to that tower, even from some distance. The carrier's engineers gave the location of the originating signal within an estimated radius of 1.5 miles. That radius enclosed roughly 7 square miles of steep, forested terrain, dropping toward a remote river valley. There was no clear reason for Daniel to have been in that area. The drainage was not part of his route. It was reachable only by a difficult cross-country traverse over a high ridge with no marked trail. It led nowhere relevant to his itinerary. Some investigators speculated that the ping might have been a transient anomaly, a reflection of the signal off a granite face. Others believed it was real, and that Daniel had for some reason left his planned route within hours of being seen by Carl Mendel and traveled in a direction he had no apparent reason to travel. The discovery prompted a second wave of searching, focused on the eastern drainage. By the time crews could mobilize, however, more than 3 feet of snow had fallen at elevation, making ground search above 4,000 feet impossible until late spring. Air searches yielded nothing. It was during this period that 2 other cases began to receive renewed attention. The first was that of Owen Calder, a 41-year-old hunter who had failed to return from an elk trip in the same wilderness in 2014. His abandoned camp had been located 8 days after his disappearance, intact, with rifle, food, and bedroll all present. His remains were never found. The official conclusion was that he had likely fallen into one of the wilderness's many concealed crevasses or been carried off by a predator. Some elements of the case, however, had never been satisfactorily explained, including the fact that his truck keys had been found inside his tent rather than on his person. The second case was older, from 1997. A college student named Lillian Park had vanished during a guided weekend backpacking trip with 2 friends. She had been seen by her companions at a creek crossing in mid-afternoon. 20 minutes later, when they reached the next clearing, she was no longer with them. They had assumed she was filtering water at the creek and would catch up. She never did. The search for her had lasted 3 weeks and recovered only her water bottle, found a quarter-mile off the trail, upright in the dirt, with the lid off. Investigators were careful not to imply any connection between the 3 cases. They emphasized that Cedar Hollow saw thousands of visitors each year, and that 3 disappearances over more than 2 decades was statistically consistent with the broader profile of similar western wilderness areas. Yet for those involved in the Reeve case, the prior incidents lingered in the background of the investigation. In late April of 2020, 6 months after Daniel's disappearance, a Forest Service crew clearing winter blowdown along a fire road 13 miles north of the Cedar Hollow trailhead found a tan baseball cap caught in the fork of a young hemlock about 8 feet off the ground. The cap matched the description Carl Mendel had given. The embroidered logo confirmed it. DNA analysis recovered from sweat residue on the inner band confirmed it had belonged to Daniel Reeve. The cap was located approximately 23 miles by trail from the wooden footbridge where the satellite messenger had last pinged, and on the opposite side of the wilderness from the eastern drainage where the cell tower had registered the handshake. There was no plausible direct path between any 2 of the 3 locations that did not involve at least 2 days of difficult cross-country travel for a healthy hiker carrying a full pack. There was no obvious reason such a hiker, alone and on schedule, would have made that journey. There was also no body. In the years that followed, investigators and outside analysts proposed 4 primary theories to explain Daniel Reeves' disappearance. Each was internally plausible. Each required at least one assumption that the available evidence either failed to support or actively contradicted. The first theory was hypothermia. In wilderness settings, hypothermia is responsible for a substantial fraction of fatal solo disappearances. Its progression follows a recognizable pattern. As body temperature falls, judgment deteriorates. Victims become disoriented. They make navigational errors they would never make in a healthy state. In the late stages, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing causes some victims to remove their outer clothing, a counterintuitive response to peripheral vasodilation that creates a sensation of intense heat. Some victims also exhibit terminal burrowing behavior, crawling into small enclosed spaces such as hollow logs or crevices in rock. These end-of-life behaviors mean that hypothermia victims are sometimes found in unexpected places, partially clothed, and far from any logical line of travel. The hypothermia theory could account for the lost cap, the unexpected cellular ping, and the absence of any direct trail. It struggled to account for the timing. Conditions on October 18th were cold but not extreme. A healthy, well-equipped hiker in his condition was at low risk in the morning hours. Hypothermia would normally have required a triggering event such as injury, immersion in water, or an unplanned overnight exposure in worsening weather. None of those had been confirmed. The second theory was predation. Cougar attacks on adult human beings are exceedingly rare in the Pacific Northwest, but they do occur. A bear could potentially have surprised a lone hiker. A large predator could in principle have moved a body across significant distances over a period of weeks. Forensic specialists, however, considered this scenario unlikely for several reasons. Predators typically cache prey near the kill site rather than moving it dozens of miles. Bone scatter from a predation event would normally remain within a much smaller radius. The recovery of an undamaged hat in good condition hung in a tree more than 20 miles from any plausible attack site did not match any documented pattern of large carnivore behavior. The third theory was foul play, and it focused for a brief period on Carl Mendel. Mendel's account placed him at the trail junction at the same time as Daniel. He had not signed the register. He had left the wilderness without speaking to anyone. He had waited 9 days before contacting law enforcement. To investigators trained to notice such patterns, the combination raised questions. They reviewed his background, interviewed him 3 times, examined his vehicle, and corroborated his timeline against highway camera footage. Mendel had no prior record. His vehicle had been recorded passing a state highway camera at 6:12 in the evening, more than 70 miles from the trailhead, on the day of the disappearance, consistent with his stated time of departure. He had explained his delay in coming forward as a combination of not realizing the disappearance had occurred and a general reluctance to involve himself in police matters. After several months, he was eliminated as a suspect. No other person of interest emerged. The fourth theory was voluntary disappearance. In the months following Daniel's disappearance, investigators reviewing his finances and personal correspondence identified several details that did not match the public picture of a successful, contented man. He had taken on substantial debt over the previous year. He had lost a major client 3 months before the trip. His apartment lease was up for renewal at a rate he had not arranged to pay. He had recently downloaded several research articles on remote regions of British Columbia and on the procedures used to obtain non-citizen documentation in certain Latin American countries. None of these details was conclusive. Many people read about subjects unrelated to their actual plans. Many people experience financial pressure without acting on the impulse to vanish. The search of his apartment also recovered a personal journal in which he had written, in an entry dated 3 weeks before the trip, a single sentence that investigators found difficult to dismiss. The sentence read, in his handwriting, that he had been thinking again about how easy it would be to stop existing on paper. His sister, when shown the entry, recognized the language. She said her brother had used similar phrasing during a difficult period in his late 20s, a period during which he had spoken openly with her about his unhappiness. He had recovered. He had built what looked, from the outside, like a stable life. The entry from October was, she said, a relapse of an old habit of mind. She did not believe he would have actually done it, but she allowed that she could not prove it. On April 14, 2021, 14 months after Daniel Reeves' disappearance, a backcountry hunter following a game trail on a heavily forested slope 8 miles north of the Cedar Hollow trailhead and approximately 15 miles from the location where the cap had been recovered, found a partially buried frame backpack at the base of a fallen cedar. The pack was deteriorated but recognizable as Daniel's. Inside were the remains of his sleeping bag, a stove, a damaged water filter, and a closed plastic bag containing 2 paper maps and his permit slip from the ranger station, signed and dated October 16th. A search of the immediate area over the following 4 days recovered fragmentary skeletal remains within a 30-meter radius. Dental records confirmed identification within 72 hours. The remains were highly weathered and had been disturbed by animals. The medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. There was no evidence of trauma to the recovered bones, but several long bones and the skull had not been recovered, and any soft tissue evidence had been lost months earlier. The location at which the remains were found could not be reached from the planned hiking loop without a difficult and counterintuitive cross-country traverse. It was downhill from the campsite by a steep but navigable drainage. It was uphill from the cellular ping location by a considerable distance. There was no marked trail within 3 miles. The pack was found at the base of a tree large enough to have offered shelter. The sleeping bag had been removed from its stuff sack and partially deployed, as though preparation for use had been interrupted. The medical examiner's final report listed the cause and manner of death as undetermined. The case was officially classified as a recovery, not a homicide investigation, and was closed at the operational level in early 2022. It remains open in the formal sense, as is standard practice. In the years since, several writers, podcasters, and amateur investigators have attempted to construct a narrative that ties the recovered evidence into a single coherent account. None has fully succeeded. Some focus on the cap and propose a hypothermic wandering scenario in which Daniel left his route after the morning of the 18th, climbed to a high ridge in the eastern drainage where his phone briefly registered with a tower, became disoriented, descended in the wrong direction, and eventually died of exposure in the area where his pack was eventually found. This account requires Daniel to have traveled approximately 26 miles of off-trail terrain in worsening conditions, mostly without any apparent reason, during a period in which he had food, shelter, and intact navigational tools. Others focus on the journal entry and propose that Daniel staged his own disappearance, walked out of the wilderness via a back route he had researched in advance, and abandoned his gear later to mislead investigators. This account fails to explain how a person fleeing his own life would leave behind a permit, identifiable equipment, and a recognizable hat in a configuration designed almost perfectly to delay rather than prevent identification of his remains. It also fails to explain why no record exists of any subsequent activity in his name anywhere in the world. He has not used a credit card, accessed a bank account, or contacted his sister for more than 6 years. A third group of analysts suggests that the case is, in the end, simply a layered accident. That Daniel met with some unrecorded misfortune in the early hours of his hike, after Carl Mendel saw him at the junction, that he survived for some period of time in compromised condition, that he covered a surprising amount of ground in a state of increasing disorientation, and that the pieces of the puzzle were left where they fell because nature does not arrange evidence for the convenience of investigators. This is the most parsimonious account. It is also the least satisfying, because it leaves every specific question unanswered. Why did he stop on the trail and look back, the way Carl Mendel described? What had he heard, or thought he had heard? What pulled him eastward into a drainage he had no reason to enter? What did he do during the hours between the morning ping and the afternoon one? Why did the cap end up in a tree, 20 miles from where it should have been, undamaged, as though placed there? Cedar Hollow remains open. Each year, hundreds of hikers walk the same trail Daniel walked, past the wooden footbridge, past the junction where Carl Mendel saw a man stop and look back at something only he could see. Most return to their cars by sundown. A small number do not, and most of those are found. Statistically, the wilderness is no more dangerous than any comparable area in the Western Cascades. The numbers do not support the idea of a pattern. What the numbers do not capture, however, is the particular weight of standing at the trail register on a quiet October afternoon and seeing, in the column for that day's entries, a single name in faded ink, signed with a careful return date, from a person who never came back to cross it out. That weight does not require any special explanation. The fact that no satisfying ordinary explanation has yet been found is in the end the only thing the case still has to teach.